There were 15,000 people in Claypole, but only one actress. She kept a milliner's shop. My name is Sprake. I kept a watchmaker and jeweller's shop next door to Miss Porteous for 15 years. During all that time, she never spoke to me. I'm not sure that she ever spoke to anyone. My wife and I were a decent, respectable, devoted couple, Wesleyans, not above speaking to anyone, but we were never good enough for Miss Porteous. But that was her affair. If she hadn't been so standoffish, she might have been alive today. As it is, she's dead, and she died, as everybody knows, on the front page of the newspapers. No one in Claypole knew much about Miss Porteous. We knew she'd been an actress, but where she'd been an actress and when, nobody knew. She looked like an actress. She was tall and very haughty, and her hair, once blonde, was something of the colour of tobacco-stained moustaches. Her lips were red and bitter, and with her haughty face she looked like a cold, nasty woman in a play. She dressed just for show, exactly the opposite of every other woman in Claypole. In winter she came out in chiffon, and in summer you would see her walking across the golf course, not speaking to anyone, in great fox furs, something the colour of her own hair. Her shop was just the same. At a time when every milliner draper in Claypole used to cram as much into the shop window as possible, Miss Porteous introduced that style of one hat on a stand and a vase of flowers on a length of velvet, but somehow it never quite came off. The solitary hat looked rather like Miss Porteous herself, lonely and haughty and out of place. The back ways of her shop and ours faced onto each other. The gardens were divided by a partition of boards and fencing, but we could see into Miss Porteous's bathroom from ours. You could even see Miss Porteous at her toilet, but you never saw anyone else there. Then one day we did see someone else there. My wife came scuffling into the shop and said that she'd seen a man in Miss Porteous's backyard. Well, what about it, I said. Perhaps that's what she wants, a man or two, I said. I was busy and I thought no more about it, but my wife did. While she was arranging the bedroom curtains, she saw the man several times. He was middle-aged and he wore a yellow tie. That night when I went to bed, the light was burning in Miss Porteous's bathroom, but I couldn't see Miss Porteous. Next morning the light was still burning. I said, "Hello, Miss Porteous left the light on all night." Then, when I went up at midday, the light was still on, and it was still on that afternoon, and it was on all that night. My wife was scared, but I said, "Oh, it's Thursday, and she's taken the day off and gone up to London." But the light went on burning all the next day, and it was still burning late that night. By that time I was puzzled myself. I went and tried Miss Porteous's shop door. It was locked, but there was really nothing strange about that. It was 11 o'clock at night and ought to have been locked. Well, we went to bed, but my wife couldn't sleep. At last, she jumped up in bed. "You've got to get a ladder out and climb up and see if everything's all right in Miss Porteous's bathroom," she said. Well, I heaved our ladder out and then ran it up to Miss Porteous's bathroom window, and then I climbed up. What I saw through the bathroom window was bad enough, but it was only when I had telephoned to the police station and we'd forced an entrance that I saw how really terrible it was. Miss Porteous was lying on the bathroom floor with a bullet wound in her chest. We banged the door against her head as we went in. She was in a pink nightgown, and the blood had made a little rosette on her chest. The next morning all Claypole knew that Miss Porteous had been murdered, and by afternoon the whole of England knew. The reporter from the Argus, the local paper, came rushing round to see me before 7 o'clock, so I made a statement. It was just a plain statement, and every word of it was true. Then, just before dinner, I saw 3 men with cameras on the opposite side of the street. They took pictures of Miss Porteous's shop, and then they came across the road into my shop. They as good as forced their way through the shop into the backyard, and there they photographed Miss Porteous's bathroom window. Then one of the cameramen put a pound note into my hand and said, "On top of the ladder." Well, the ladder was still there, so I climbed up, and they photographed me on top of it, pointing at the window. By afternoon, the crowd was packed thick right across the street. Then 4 men came up and said they were newspaper men, and could I give them the facts about Miss Porteous. Before I could speak, they pushed into the shop, they shut the door. Then I saw there were not 4 of them, but 12, and they fairly hammered me with questions. What was Miss Porteous like? How long had she been there? About the bathroom? About her hair? I was flustered, and I said something about her hair being a little reddish. And one of the newspaper men said, "Ah, now we're getting somewhere. Carrots!" And they all laughed. Then another said, Everybody says this woman was an actress, but where did she act? I don't know, I said. You've lived next door all this time and you don't know? Well, I said, she was different. Eccentric? No, I wouldn't say that. About her acting, they said, you must have heard something. Then I remembered, once at a rehearsal of the Chorus Society, her name had come up, and somebody had said something about her having been in Othello. Othello? What was she, Desdemona? Well, I said, I don't know if it's strictly true or not. I can't vouch for it. And this man that was seen, they said, what was he like? I said, I hadn't seen him, but my wife had. So they had her in. They questioned her. They were nice to her, but they put down, as in my case, things she didn't say. Yellow tie, dark, how dark, foreign-looking, actor. They questioned us all that afternoon. The next morning, the placards of the morning newspapers were all over Claypole. Shot actress, full story. It was my story, but somehow as it appeared in the papers, it wasn't true. And the headlines. Search for shot actress assailant goes on. Police anxious to interview foreigner with yellow tie. Real-life Desdemona dead in bathroom. It was Saturday. That afternoon, Claypole was besieged by hundreds of people who'd never been there before. They climbed in over the fence of my back garden and trampled on the flower beds. All the tea shops in Claypole that day were crowded out. We had reporters and photographers and detectives tramping about all that day and the next. That Sunday morning, I missed going to chapel for the first time in almost 10 years. My wife couldn't sleep. She was absolutely exhausted and kept crying. That afternoon, the crowds began again, thicker than ever. A man started to sell souvenir photographs of Claypole High Street at threepence each, and it was as though he was selling pound notes or bits of Miss Porteous' hair. That afternoon, I went for a walk, just for a few minutes to get some air. Everybody I knew stopped me and wanted to talk, and one man said, don't tell me she lived there all alone for nothing. She knew her way about. The inquest was held on the Monday. It lasted 3 days. My wife and I were witnesses, and it came out that Miss Porteous' name was not Porteous at all, but Helen Williams. Porteous had been her stage name. It also came out that it was not clear if Miss Porteous had been murdered or if she had taken her own life. All this made it much worse. The fact of Miss Porteous having had 2 names gave her an air of mystery, and the doubts about her death increased it. It began to go all over Claypole that she was a woman of a certain reputation, that the milliner's shop was just a blind. As the story of Miss Porteous grew, the story of my own part in it grew. Suddenly people began to crowd into my shop. They looked at old watches and clocks that needed repairing, brooches that had been out of fashion for years and needed remodelling. By the weekend, the shop was never empty, and by the end of the day, my wife and I were worn out by the extraordinary mad rush of business. We rested in bed all day Sunday, exhausted. I was in a dilemma, I tell you. I wanted to close the shop, but somehow it wasn't possible. Business is business, and death is death, and you've got to live, and so I kept open. Then the police came to see me again. The man with the yellow tie had not been found, and they wanted my wife and me to go to the station to check the statements we'd given. We were there 3 hours. When we got back, there was a crowd of 50 people round the shop. The rumour had gone round that I'd been arrested. Well, once that started, nothing could stop its consequences. It was all over Claypole that I knew more than I would say. It began to be said that my wife and I were busybodies. How else had we come to be squinting in Miss Porteous' bathroom? How else had we seen the man with the yellow tie in the backyard? We were peeping Toms. I never heard anyone actually say this, but there was one thing I did hear him say. I used to belong to the Temperance Club, the Melrose, and in the evenings I went there to play billiards and cards and so on. Well, next to the billiard room was a small cloakroom, and one evening, as I was hanging up my coat, I heard someone at the billiard table say, "Old Sprake knows a thing or two. Think I should be here if I had as many quid as the times old Sprake's been upstairs next door. Actress, my eye. Ever struck you it was funny old Sprake knew the colour of that nightgown so well?" I put on my coat again and went out of the club. I was trembling. What I'd heard seemed to be the crystallisation of all the rumours that were going around Claypole. That not only was Miss Porteous a loose woman, but that I'd had illicit relations with her. Not only had she been murdered, but I knew more than I would say about her murder. I didn't know what to do. I had to defend myself, so I hit upon the idea of saying the same thing to everybody. "I just don't know," I would say. I said it to everyone, just that. "I just don't know." I suppose I must have said those words hundreds of times a day. And when a man goes on repeating one sentence hundreds of times a day, it's only natural that people should begin to wonder about him. So it crept around Claypole that I was a little odd. Well, I couldn't sleep, and when I looked into the glass after a restless night, I saw a face made wretched by the strain of unresolved anxieties. I felt near to breaking. And then something important happened. The police found the man with the yellow tie. He was a theatrical producer named Prideaux, and the police found him at Brighton. The fact that his name was French and that he was found at Brighton at once established him, in the public mind, as the murderer of Miss Porteous. But he had an explanation. He hadn't come forward because he was afraid. Miss Porteous was an old friend, and her death, he said, had upset him terribly. It was true that he'd seen Miss Porteous just before her death, because Miss Porteous had invited him to come and see her. She needed money. The millinery business was not paying its way. She feared bankruptcy and apparently had threatened to take her life. Prideaux promised to do what he could, and he was back in London early that evening, which the porter of the hotel verified. It was also proved that people had seen Miss Porteous alive, walking out on the golf course as late as 5 o'clock that day. But Prideaux was in London by that time. Well, that was the end of that. It was established beyond doubt that Miss Porteous had taken her own life, and suddenly all the mystery and sensation became nothing. The papers were not interested in her any longer, and her name has never appeared in the papers again. Well, I no longer live at Claypole. All those rumours that went round were enough to drive me mad, but they were also enough to kill my wife. It was the rumour and shock and worry that killed her, and she died just after the facts of Miss Porteous's death were established. A month later I gave up the business and left town. Poor Miss Porteous. She took her life because she was hard up. There's no more to it than that. But nobody in Claypole ever believed that. In Claypole, they know that she was murdered. They know, because the paper said so, that she was a strange and eccentric woman, a loose woman. They know that she let men in and up the back stairs at £1 a time. They like to think that I was one of them, and that I knew more than I would ever say. They know all that happened to Miss Porteous, but they can never know how much has happened to me.
I made the acquaintance of Pyecraft in this very smoking room. I was a young, nervous, new member, and he saw it. I was sitting all alone, wishing I knew more of the members, and suddenly he came, a great rolling front of chins and abdomina towards me, and grunted and sat down in a chair close by me, and wheezed for a space, and scraped for a space with a match, and lit a cigar, and then addressed me. He talked about various things, and came round to games, and thence to my figure and complexion. "You ought to be a good cricketer," he said. "I suppose I am slender to what some people would call lean, and I suppose I am rather dark. Still, I am not ashamed of having a Hindu great-grandmother, but for all that I don't want casual strangers to see through me at a glance to her, so that I was set against Pyecraft from the beginning." But he only talked about me in order to get to himself. "I expect," he said, "you take no more exercise than I do, and probably eat no less." Like all excessively obese people, he fancied he ate nothing. "Yet," and he smiled an oblique smile, "we differ." And then he began to talk about his fatness, all he did for his fatness, all he was going to do for his fatness, what people had advised him to do for his fatness, and what he had heard of people doing for fatness similar to his. "A priori," he said, "one would think a question of nutrition could be answered by diet, and a question of assimilation by drugs." It was stifling. It was dumpling talk. It made me feel swelled to hear him. He came to the actual thing one day. "Our pharmacopoeia," he said, "our Western pharmacopoeia is anything but the last word of medical science. In the East, I've been told—" He stopped and stared at me. It was like being at an aquarium. I was quite suddenly angry with him. Look here, who told you about my great-grandmother's recipes? Every time we've met for a week, and we've met pretty often, you've given me a broad hint or so about that little secret of mine.
Well, he said, now the cat's out of the bag, I'll admit, yes, it is so. I had it.
From Patterson, I said. I wager it was Patterson.
Indirectly,
he said, which I believe was lying.
Yes.
Patterson, I said, took that stuff at his own risk. He pursed his mouth and bowed. My great-grandmother's recipes, I said, are queer things to handle. I own I was weak, but I was also annoyed with Pyecraft. I'd got to that state of feeling for him that disposed me to say, well, take the risk. The little affair of Patterson, to which I have alluded, was a different matter altogether. What it was doesn't concern us now, but I knew anyhow that the particular recipe I used then was safe. The rest I didn't know so much about, and on the whole I was inclined to doubt their safety pretty completely. Yet, even if Pyecraft got poisoned, I must confess the poisoning of Pyecraft struck me as an immense undertaking. That evening, I took that queer, odd-scented sandalwood box out of my safe and turned the rustling skins over. The gentleman who wrote the recipes for my great-grandmother evidently had a weakness for skins of a miscellaneous origin, and his handwriting was cramped to the last degree. But I found the one that I knew was there soon enough, and sat on the floor by my safe for some time, looking at it. Look here, I said to Pyecraft next day, and snatched the slip away from his eager grasp. So far as I can make it out, this is a recipe for loss of weight. Ah, said Pyecraft. I'm not absolutely sure, but I think it's that. I made him promise never to say a word to me about his disgusting fatness again, whatever happened. Never. And then I handed him that little piece of skin. It's nasty stuff, I said.
No matter,
he said, and took it. He goggled at it.
But...
He had just discovered that it wasn't English. To the best of my ability, I said, I will do you a translation. I did my best. After that, we didn't speak for a fortnight. And then he got a word in.
I must speak, he said. It isn't fair. There's something wrong. It's done me no good. You're not doing your great-grandmother justice.
Where's the recipe? He produced it gingerly from his pocketbook. I ran my eye over the items. Was the egg addled? I said.
No. Ought it to have been?
That, I said, goes without saying in all my poor dear great-grandmother's recipes. When condition or quality is not specified, you must get the worst. She was drastic or nothing. And there's one or two possible alternatives to some of these other things. You got fresh rattlesnake venom.
I got rattlesnake from Jamracks. It cost...
That's your affair, anyhow. What about this last item?
I did my best. I know a man who...
Yes. Well, I'll write the alternatives down. So far as I know the language, the spelling of this recipe is particularly atrocious. By the by, dog here probably means pariah dog. For a month after that, I saw Pyecraft constantly at the club, and as fat and anxious as ever. He kept our treaty, but at times he broke the spirit of it by shaking his head despondently. And then, quite unexpectedly, his telegram came.
For heaven's sake, come, Pyecraft.
Pyecraft inhabited the upper half of a house in Bloomsbury, and I went there as soon as I had done my coffee and liqueur. Mr. Pyecraft, I said, at the front door. They believed he was ill. He hadn't been out for 2 days. He expects me, I said, and they sent me up. I rang the bell at the door on the landing. He shouldn't have tried it anyhow, I said to myself. A man who eats like a pig ought to look like a pig. There came a call from inside the door.
That you, Formalin?
That you, Pyecraft? Then I could hear a curious pattering upon the door, almost like someone feeling for the handle in the dark, and Pyecraft's familiar grunts. I heard the key turn. Then Pyecraft's voice said,
Come in.
I turned the handle and opened the door. Naturally, I expected to see Pyecraft. Well, you know, he wasn't there. I never had such a shock in my life. There was his sitting room, in a state of untidy disorder, plates and dishes among the books and writing things, and several chairs overturned, but Pyecraft...
It's all right, old man. Shut the door,
he said. And then I discovered him. There he was, right up close to the cornice in the corner by the door, as though someone had glued him to the ceiling. His face was anxious and angry. He panted and gesticulated.
"Shut the door."
I shut the door and went and stood away from him and stared. "If anything gives way and you tumble down," I said, "you'll break your neck, Pyecraft."
"I wish I could,"
he said. "A man of your age and weight getting up to childish gymnastics."
"Don't,"
he said, and looked agonized.
"Your damned great-grandmother."
"Be careful," I said. "Anyway, how the deuce are you holding on up there?" And then, abruptly, I realized that he was not holding on at all, that he was floating up there, just as a gas-filled bladder might have floated in the same position. He began a struggle to thrust himself away from the ceiling and to clamber down the wall to me, panting.
"It's that prescription,"
he said.
"Too successful.
"How?"
Loss of weight. Almost complete."
And then, of course, I understood. "By Jove, Pyecraft," I said, "what you wanted was a cure for fatness. But you always called it weight. You would call it weight." Somehow I was extremely delighted. I quite liked Pyecraft for the time. "Let me help you," I said, and took his hand and pulled him down. He kicked about, trying to get a foothold somewhere. It was very like holding a flag on a windy day.
"That table,"
he said, pointing,
"is solid mahogany and very heavy. If you can put me under that."
I did, and there he wallowed about like a captive balloon while I stood on his hearthrug and talked to him. I lit a cigar. "Tell me," I said, "what happened?"
"I took it,"
he said.
"and then I kept on getting lighter and helpless, you know."
He gave way suddenly to a burst of passion.
"What the goodness am I to do?"
"There's one thing pretty evident," I said, "that you mustn't do. If you go out of doors, you'll go up and up." I waved an arm upward.
"I suppose it will wear off."
I shook my head. "I don't think you can count on that." And then there was another burst of passion, and he kicked out at adjacent chairs and banged the floor. He behaved just as I should have expected a great, fat, self-indulgent man to behave under trying circumstances, that is to say, very badly. He spoke of me and of my great-grandmother with an utter want of discretion. "I never asked you to take the stuff," I said. And generously disregarding the insults he was putting upon me, I sat down in his armchair and began to talk to him in a sober, friendly fashion. I suggested that it would not be difficult for him to learn to walk about on the ceiling with his hands.
"I can't sleep,"
he said. But that was no great difficulty. It was quite possible, I pointed out, to make a shake-up under a wire mattress, fasten the underthings on with tapes, and have a blanket, sheet, and coverlid to button at the side. He would have to confide in his housekeeper, I said, and after some squabbling he agreed to that. He could have a library ladder in his room, and all his meals could be laid on the top of his bookcase. And we agreed there must be iron staples along the skirting so that he could cling to those whenever he wanted to get about the room on the lower level. As we got on with the thing, I found myself almost keenly interested. In fact, I spent 2 whole days at his flat. I'm a handy interfering sort of man with a screwdriver, and I made all sorts of ingenious adaptations for him. Ran a wire to bring his bells within reach, turned all his electric lights up instead of down, and so on. The whole affair was extremely curious and interesting to me, and it was delightful to think of Pyecraft like some great fat blowfly crawling about on his ceiling and clambering down the lintel of his doors from one room to another, and never, never, never coming to the club any more. Then, you know, my fatal ingenuity got the better of me. I was sitting by his fire, drinking his whiskey, and he was up in his favourite corner by the cornice, tacking a Turkey carpet to the ceiling, when the idea struck me. "By Jove, Pyecraft," I said, "all this is totally unnecessary." And before I could calculate the complete consequences of my notion, I blurted it out. "Lead underclothing," I said, and the mischief was done. Pyecraft received the thing almost in tears.
"To be right ways up again,"
he said. I gave him the whole secret before I saw where it would take me. "Buy sheet lead," I said. "Stamp it into discs. Sew 'em all over your underclothes until you have enough. Have lead-soled boots. Carry a bag of solid lead. And the thing is done. Instead of being a prisoner here, you may go abroad again, Pyecraft. In his emotion, he dropped the tack hammer within an ace of my head.
By Jove, he said, I shall be able to come back to the club again.
The thing pulled me up short. By Jove, I said, yes, of course. You will. He did. He does. There he sits behind me now, stuffing, as I live, a third go of buttered tea cake. And no one in the whole world knows, except his housekeeper and me, that he weighs practically nothing, that he is a mere boring mass of assimilatory matters, mere clouds in clothing, and most inconsiderable of men. There he sits, watching, until I have done this writing. Then, if he can, he will waylay me. He will come billowing up to me. He will tell me over again all about it, how it feels, how it doesn't feel, how he sometimes hopes it is passing off a little. And always somewhere in that fat, abundant discourse he will say, "The secret's keeping, eh? If anyone knew of it, I should be so ashamed. Makes a fellow look such a fool, you know, crawling about on a ceiling and all that." And now to elude Pyecraft, occupying, as he does, an admirable strategic position between me and the door.